All right, I think we should be good to go then. All right, so I'll call the Budget Advisory Commission for July 11th to order. And I'll start with the land acknowledgement on the agenda. A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and the land. I'd like to acknowledge that we live and work on the unceded land of the Dena'ina people and thank them for their past, present, and future stewardship of the land on which we all live. And then we could do a roll call.
Mr. Matthew Harvey,
Present.
Mr. Alex Money,
Here.
Mr. Brian Flynn, Mr. Robert Helder,
Present.
Ms. Lindsay Hobson, Mr. Mark Lukin,
Here.
Ms. Carla McConnell.
Here.
Mr. Jared Beadle,
Present.
and Ms. Carmela Warfield.
And then the next item on the agenda is approval of the agenda, but not sure if we have quorum right now. Because of the, so we might just move past that, have an unofficial meeting, and we don't plan on taking action on anything today anyway, so. Move on to informational reports for the chair's report. If you look at the official roster, we have 3 seats that are expired, and we have now 2 seats that are vacant. Member Clouda just resigned from the commission because he picked up a position within the new administration. And so we're looking to fill seats now. So could, if you have one of the expired terms, reapply or let us know, and we'll talk with the administration, the new administration, about maybe put some more appointees in front of the assembly. Trying to fill up the commission again. We were doing pretty good for a few months there, having a lot of attendance.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You're saying you don't have quorum because there are people here today that are expired, or we don't have enough?
We only have one person here today. Jared's term expired at the end of the fiscal year, June 30th. And so he can still come. We were a little unclear as to whether it served for 90 days and still count for quorum or not. But
It appears like that they could serve until they're replaced.
Whichever comes sooner, 90 days or whenever.
So technically he is part quorum.
okay, yeah.
I know, do we have quorum?
Yes.
So if we do have quorum, we can roll back up the agenda and move to approve the agenda. I'll move to agenda.
Mr. Chair, I move to approve the agenda of our last meeting.
Of this meeting.
I'm like,
I'm hearing no objection. The agenda will be approved as written. And then going back up to informational reports for the chair's report. So with those expired terms, we'll treat those as active until replaced or the grace period is over. And then with that resignation, yeah, we have active non-expired seats, just enough to make quorum if everybody shows up. But outside of that, I think we'll talk about the rest down in agenda item 9, which is really just next scheduled meetings. Moving on to the assembly report.
Yeah. Hi, everyone, Anna Brawley on the assembly. I will give just a brief update, and it's not so much kind of, well, and also I'll say, I know I'm on the agenda a little bit later to give more specifics about 2 things we're working on, the alcohol tax strategic plan and marijuana tax creation of the new board and kind of where that funding goes. So I'll save those for later. But kind of some other updates. Of course, there's a new administrations, and I know that they're going to speak to what they're up to. But generally speaking, you know, the assembly has been, you know, stepping back, letting those get up to speed. And so it's summer, right? So there's not a lot of big kind of things happening, although of course there are a lot of big issues in the city. So we're not slowing down our work so much, but at least for me over the 4th, I was kind of taking a few days to step back. Anyway, so some of the big things just to be aware of, and I think I brought some of these up last month. It's kind of big, really big questions that are before the city, I think, and at least that's the way I'm thinking about some of these topics, and also bringing them of course, to the administration, and a lot of other folks have talked about this. So I'll just bring up three of them. One is housing. So last month we passed a very small version of the home initiative, which I was one of the sponsors of, and that allows duplexes in what were single family only neighborhoods. So I'll just note, there's still a lot of places that are single family homes that are in HOAs, homeowner associations. Those private covenants on property still apply. So it actually does not have as big of an impact as it might look on paper if you look at where these zones are. And then really, I think the biggest value that I'm hoping to see from that long term, of course, would be some new construction, but knowing the cost of new construction and all the other pieces is, I think there's a more short-term benefit to be gained from allowing folks to subdivide existing homes. So we have a lot of 70 split levels, for example. You could split that home in half. And that is actually a way that many other cities have dealt with their, just housing stock as it ages, right? You think of old Victorian homes in other places that get turned into apartments. A lot of our zoning doesn't allow that until now. So anyway, so it remains to be seen how that plays out. But it's, again, just one of really many big housing issues that we have. And the challenge is, it is not economically feasible to build most anything in this town with our current conditions. And some of that is our own rules. Some of that is interest rates being high. Some of that is our land value is very high relative to the rents you can get, right? So there's all these pieces to solving that economic problem of how we build housing because the conditions are not great. So that's really big picture what we're going to continue to focus on. And I'm sure that's a priority of the administration as well. One of those that we're going to be continue talking about, in fact, prior meeting and the next meeting that I'm in today, tax incentives, tax abatement, and basically how do you encourage people to build new things to add to our tax base, and how do you use our tax relief to make that more possible. So there's an existing tax abatement or I think it's deteriorated property incentive on our agenda for Tuesday. It's been in place for 10 years or so. It's the one, I think it's the one downtown or Fairview. I can't remember, but it's one that's been in place so that the ordinance on the agenda is to just extend it for another 10 years. But there's a bigger conversation of what we have on the books right now. Are those working or not? Because we haven't seen a lot of people use them. How could we make them better? And then if and how we should expand, right? Do new ones. And then, of course, all of that comes down to it is a shift to current taxpayers, right? And so the intent is that it's not a forever tax shift, that you're allowing somebody to build a building to pay their loans back, and then eventually it's on the tax rolls. But anyway, so that's a big conversation that I just want to really introduce that's going to continue moving forward. And it's something that you guys could consider for a future agenda. And we're going to be continuing over the next several months talking about that. So I don't have a specific proposal other than that one small ordinance for now. But the really kind of structural thing to understand is adjusted for inflation, our tax base is declining. And it basically means we're not adding a lot of new buildings to our city. And all of the buildings we have are aging. And even though the value of them may be going up, the price may go up, the actual, that they're older and older. And so in theory, they should be like either losing value or maintaining value as other things get more expensive when new things get built. So that's a structural problem just to think about, that if we don't add to our tax base, we're basically taxing the existing properties more and more to pay for a city that we structurally cannot pay for. And that leads to the other big discussion that also came up this morning is really how do we maintain the city that we've already built? So that's roads, water and sewer, aging properties, aging public facilities. I'll use the PAC as an example, the Performing Arts Center. How do we maintain that property that was built 40 years ago? And another kind of conversation that's come up along there is our fleet. So we have APD has an aging fleet, fire department has an aging fleet, and our snowplow, this morning we were talking about our snowplow and graders and those other vehicles that are also way beyond their normal service life. The way that we've historically paid for that is to go to the state and ask for money, or, to a lesser extent, put it on our bonds. There is not enough money in the state to pay for that, right? And we're not going to get that money going forward as a city, even though we can be more strategic about what we ask for. So that's just another structural cost. We physically cannot, or we cannot pay for the physical city infrastructure that we have long term. And so again, it's just something that we can't solve right now, but it's important to start getting that idea out there because because just the way that our city is built, the way that our financial structure is built, you know, we can't pay for that. And I'm not saying the answer is that we all tax ourselves twice as much, because the economy, right? The people who live here could not support that. So it really is a big question that we have to start untangling. And again, there's a lot of pieces to it, but that's really the bottom line, is how do we pay for the city we've already built? And also how do we expand, you know, and grow going forward? So, anyways, so that's more kind of big philosophical existential questions to put on the table versus updates. But I think really that's some of the questions that we need to think about, even as we're focusing on, you know, kind of the emergencies or the urgent issues today, like public safety, like homelessness, right? Which I know the administration is putting together their strategy for. But just to say it's both at once, right? We have to think about what's happening now, and we want to think long term. And I think that's again where this body can think about, you know, how you want to weigh in on those questions. You know, do you want to explore something like that? Do you want to get presentations, for example, AEDC's sales tax proposal, right? You can interrogate proposals like that. But just to say again, housing, tax incentives and abatement, and then this general question of how do we pay for infrastructure and operations and maintaining our city are some of the huge questions that we have to wrestle with going forward. And beyond that, I think we're going to be moving into our budget process, but really the assembly's role in that comes a little bit later. So I would defer to the administration as far as next steps on that. But just to say, those are kind of the things that are swirling around right now. And then I can also take questions.
Any questions?
On the housing, being able to build multifamily on single family lots, let's just use the example of the split level. How will adding another family on there help you with taxes?
So
when the building has not increased or the lot has not increased.
yeah, that's a good question. I think even if it kind of depends on the property too, right? What condition it's in, how much land they have. I think in general, if you add another housing unit, even if you're not expanding the footprint of the building, then in theory it has a higher economic value. Which could mean that you're renting, and so you're able to have a unit that you're renting, and that's offsetting your mortgage, which includes, you know, you build in your property tax payments. It could allow a multi-generational family, you know, so a mother-in-law living with their kids, but they don't want to be in the same house, right? But they're close by. There are, you know, again, multi-generational families where everybody lives in, say, a fourplex, right? They each have their own unit, but they collectively pay for that property. And so I think it depends on the existing condition of the property and then what improvements are made to it. I think allowing housing units on the land and the properties that we already have is going to increase the number of taxpayers potentially, or at least folks who are paying the taxes of those properties.
Yeah.
So it's going to really increase your property taxes
Potentially.
overall. Oh, it will. I think another question, how is you going to handle parking on those units?
I think it's an interesting question. So in the whole process with the home initiative, a lot of people brought up issues that I think are not caused by and not solved by zoning. So dealing with parking, whether it's people having driveways, you know, on their property or using the street for parking, this is an issue that every other city has. And really the way to solve it is to better manage our right of way, whether it's requiring people to move cars more regularly, especially for snow plowing. It is dealing with how we build driveways. We've allowed entire streets to be built that are all driveway that have no public parking on the street. So we have to consider when we build streets, right? Wait, what are we creating? Are we creating that public space for parking or not? And as properties redevelop, right, how do you do that? So, and the other question is, you know, really single family neighborhoods. I'll use North Turnagain, for example. I bike through there all the time, single family neighborhood. Almost no one parks on the street. And so almost all of the curb on every block has street parking. It's not common for people to use it because they all have driveways. That doesn't mean that we don't have the space for parking. So a lot of single family neighborhoods actually have the most available parking because they have the fewest housing units. And a lot of the parking issues people bring up are in areas that already have multifamily housing because you have more people per block.
So some of these has X thousand square feet. So we're gonna add another unit on with a two-car garage. And then where's the parking? I see that in our area. That, unfortunately, we have nice lots, 8,400 square feet. And there's a lot of room to park. But I can see the new subdivisions have less wide streets. So that's not going to work too well, even in our area. If I'm saying, look, I could put another house in back, but where are they gonna park? I got 3 cars. And we park in our driveway, but where are they going to park? And I think it's a realistic problem that's probably the first thing you got to address is how is going to affect parking. That's number one, because that's going to be effective in all those zones.
Yeah, so something when the assembly, before I started in 2022, removed parking minimums, meaning there was not a required number of spaces you had to build. What we're seeing is most housing projects are still putting in parking, whether it's surface parking, garages, or both. And at the same time, though, the assembly funded a right-of-way study and a snow management study. So this is, again, November 2022. The money is sitting with the planning department. I believe the latest is that they've gotten a contractor on board to do that, to consult, to do that study. But again, that's really the question, because if we don't make the changes to our zoning code, we will never solve our housing problems. We have built a city that, again, we are not able to maintain with our current tax base and our current land use.
Maybe we don't want to increase the population.
That is an interesting choice to make for a city that wants to survive for the next 100 years.
Well, there's a lot of cities that are over 100 years old. And they're surviving. So I think you gotta, you know.
Yes, then, you know, I guess along your lines, I think where you get your tax base is through bringing in industry, you know, those type of things, right? So what is the incentive, or I guess, what are you doing to incentivize bringing that type of tax base in rather than just think about residential homes?
I think that going back for about 10 years with AEDC, the number one finding they've had every year when they survey employers is that workforce housing and housing in general is the choke point. And we have not built hardly any housing for at least 10 and almost 20 years at this point. Apartments have been infeasible to build since before we rewrote the zoning code. So that was 2012. It was found to be infeasible to build a new apartment building without subsidy, which is why we're not seeing them. And it's pretty much the same story with condos. Multi-unit buildings are infeasible to build in our city and have been for a long time. So what we have is a backlog of not having built housing, and every employer in the city has said that that is the number one problem. And so that's why I'm so focused on housing. It's not because that's the only answer. That is the answer that has been given to us by the business community for many years to say, we need to fix this. And the other piece of it too is not just where we can build and what we can build, it's the development process, right? So we cost developers and individual people thousands of dollars and months of their time unnecessarily because we have an inefficient permitting process. So that's the other big piece. It's not so much a code change, so the assembly's not as focused on that, but I continue to say to the prior administration and this administration, that is a huge priority. So it's not an either or, it's just each piece of this solves part of the problem.
I think what you're gonna see is destruction of the single home family neighborhoods in the whole area, unfortunately. And you're gonna see a bigger division between those that can live on the hillside and those that have to live in the whole area. Because I just think it's a terrible idea to destroy our single family neighborhoods. Maybe all new construction. I know you said there's not much coming, but I just think it's a terrible, terrible thing to destroy Rogers Park, Turnagain, some of these very beautiful pocket neighborhoods that what every person wants to achieve eventually, with just a single family home in a neighborhood like those. So
I hear your concern. I guess two things I'll offer briefly. One is the status quo. The situation that we've had for about the last 10 years basically does incentivize people building only larger homes on the hillside. And so that that segregation is already happening. And I don't mean segregation like racial segregation, but I mean economic segregation. And then also I think it's interesting to reflect on what single family means, because in zoning, it means one housing unit that assumes two parents and kids living in that house, or, you know, a household of a nuclear family. But when you say single family to a person or anybody who has a family, that could mean multi-generational. It could mean chosen family. It could mean people rooming together. It could mean blended families, you know, stepkids that, you know, like there's all kinds of different configurations of what a family is. And I think there's a disconnect between how we define it in our land use and how it actually plays out in the real world. So I guess I would offer that.
Yeah, and if the commission's open to it too, I mean, we can have a future meeting, maybe more focused on planning and zoning. I think it kind of starts with a policy direction, which might be, you know, I know one of the assembly's priorities is housing, just in general, addressing the housing shortage. And I think in the assembly's legislative agenda, they tie that back to kind of the tax base, and then to a little bit of districtization, but also employers have been asking for housing, because a lot of employers, for example, when BP was up here, just speaking from personal experience, they would move people up here and pay for it. And there's a lot of companies, Santos as another example, that aren't incented. They're incented currently not to do that because it costs a lot of money. So it is tied to that. But then we're kind of in the policy decision side, and as the commission, I think that there's also maybe we could look at based on different proposals that are out there for zoning or changes that have currently been made, how that affects property taxes and kind of just the financial ramifications of property taxes and planning and zoning. And is the commission for a future meeting, we can make that a main topic. If everybody's
Agreed, and you're right, we need to keep it based on how it affects taxes, budget, those kinds of things. So, yeah.
Which it does. It absolutely,
Yeah,
it absolutely will. And you know, if you disincentivize people to live certain areas, it will. And if you maybe more incentivize or expand the housing opportunities, it could go multiple ways depending on the assumptions you make about how it affects things. So it is tied to policy, but I might, if everybody's okay with it, move to the next thing and kind of keep that in the hopper as a main agenda item that we might look at in the future. It's a big enough topic. Next on the agenda, we have alcohol and marijuana taxes. I know Assemblymember Brawley has a. We have that next on the agenda.
Oh, okay.
I know you have a 12, I'm setting a deadline at 12:30
Oh, okay.
for you. If the school district's okay with.
That's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so you guys, or as you said, the chair asked me to give an update on kind of two projects that are in process, and they very much are in process. So I'm not coming saying, here is our plan, or here's where this money's gonna go. And of course, we've had discussions about where alcohol tax money has gone. So I'm just gonna give a kind of updates of where we are in the process. And then these are also ones that, as I said, are actively moving. So could be for future agenda or, you know, just providing individual comments if you guys are interested as well. But I'm going to talk both about the strategic plan around alcohol tax revenue, which has been in place for 3 years now, but we're looking at kind of what is the best use of those funds and how do we make sure that they're being effective going forward. And then also the marijuana tax, which was something that passed last year, dedicating all that money to early education and childcare. So I'll give an update on kind of where we are in that process as well. So this is part one of two. And then what I'll do is I'll pause because there's two different pieces of this. So I will.
About how long is this gonna take?
It sounds like we have till 12:30, so I'll try to spend about 10 minutes per topic and then we can leave.
Yeah, I had it budgeted until 12:30. Also, I had asked Assemblymember Brawley a little bit on short notice, so I appreciated her stepping into this. But in general, the reason I asked, while she works on that, the reason I asked is I was aware that the assembly is working on a long-term plan, strategic plan for alcohol tax revenue. And with regards to marijuana tax revenue, we heard last time that there was I forget the specific name, but a steering committee for what the distributions, the actual administration and distribution of those funds should go toward. So this was just a little bit more information on those changes.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Now PowerPoint actually wants to respond. So,
No problem.
okay, so alcohol tax, and I provided some background information because there's, if you want the ballot measure language, I'm not going to go into all the detail, but essentially, alcohol tax was passed in 2020, went into effect 2021, and by charter, it has a list of things that you could spend funding on. So these are the three categories. So police, basically public safety is the short version, but police and first responders, addressing child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, and then one topic that's actually a few topics, funding for substance misuse, addiction recovery, mental and behavioral health, and also homelessness. And then I'll note, of course, most of the funding, not all of it, but a good chunk of it since 2021 has gone toward homelessness, but it is a menu of things that it can be spent on. So the general idea around where we should be trying to put our funding long-term is to go upstream, right? So to not always be paying for emergency response, which is of course important, but very expensive and doesn't solve anything. It just manages something, but it's really move upstream. And so this is the general idea. And again, this is alcohol tax, but I think it's a general philosophy, right, is to fund things like prevention. And so, for example, if we want to reduce child abuse and sexual assault and other forms of crime, really, there is a lot of evidence that shows if you support kids and families in the first year of life, if you encourage things like early literacy, it gets kids ready for school, and then that has downstream effects because you literally see fewer people in jail. And that is a very well-studied body of work, not just here, but, nationally. So the idea is that a lot of what affects people's behavior and their circumstances are social factors, income, education, safety, social support, right? So thinking about how we increase those things and increase families' ability to thrive will start to reduce those other problems. So that's really the general idea. In addition to the strategic plan, there's work on communications about where the funding has already gone, because of course it's funded things like homelessness. It's also funded our mobile crisis team. It's funded early education. It's funding some pre-K classrooms over at ASD, right? So there's a lot of different things that it's going toward. But the goal is to help the public understand that and to really demonstrate the impact so that we can say to voters, the money that you allowed us to collect is going to good use. So that is in the form of the Cheers to You Anchorage campaign. If you've been out in a bar or restaurant lately, you might have seen some of these materials. These are basically ways to get out to the public where the money has been spent and what impact it's having. This is a lot of text, but you can, I'll send the slides out afterwards. Essentially, there was a survey done in January looking at kind of what people's awareness of the tax is. Do they understand that we have a tax, what it's doing? And then also generally their level of support for that. So what it found, and I'll just kind of pick out the key points here. Most people don't know where the funds are going. So even though it was on the ballot, even though it has these dedicated uses, the general public is not aware of that. However, 2/3 of residents who, responded to the survey support the alcohol tax, even not knowing where it goes. When they were then told where the funding is going in the survey, their support went up to, it went by over 10%, so at least 77%. So really there is support for this in the community, but there's not understanding where the funding is going. So that is the problem to try to solve. And especially when talked about addressing child abuse and domestic violence, people were very supportive of, yes, we need to put resources toward this. So that's a gap, right, is to increase people's understanding. So one of the ways to do that, and again, not everybody's going to want to sit down and read technical reports, is to get this information out in the community. So these are pictures of some materials. The Cheers to You Anchorage thing is basically saying, thank you for the investment you're making in our kids, in public safety. And these are just, again, some of the examples. So it educates folks about what they do. And then the idea was to put these in places where people are consuming alcohol and paying the tax, right? So you buy a beer, you can put your beer glass on one of these coasters. Here, I'll go to the next slide. That's the front and back of the coaster. So on the front, it says, learn more about the alcohol tax at the website, cheersanchorage.org, where it's got all of that detail if you want to look up where it goes. But then on the back, here's one example. An investment in mental health first responders is an investment in safer communities. So it's letting people know what the money's going toward. The mobile crisis team also has extremely high public support. People value that as a service. Whether or not you've used it, people value that it exists. So really just connecting the dots between where the money's where the money's going and what it's doing, what services it's providing. So that outreach work is going forward.
How you,
On any of these brochures, do they show any dollars and cents?
I don't know, let's see, this one does not necessarily, but I think the audience is somebody sitting in a bar, right? So they may not absorb that number, but the Cheers Anchorage website has all of the information. It basically has the entire alcohol tax budget translated into a more easy to read version.
So maybe that's why people aren't aware of it. Okay.
when was the Cheers to You Anchorage campaign started?
It was actually, the initial kind of work on it started back in 2022, because it was actually a project I worked on before I started running for assembly. But it's been moving forward, and then really has been expanded as far as what materials have developed. So I think it's really gone out in the community the end of last year and this year.
Since we're asking questions, in the actual, sorry, I didn't, so I can't hear, in the actual language on the ballot that's put out to the public, did it actually say homelessness? Because I don't recall that.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, basically, these are the three. So the only thing that wasn't on the ballot is safety.
It did say that resources to prevent and address Anchorage's homelessness.
Did it actually?
Yeah.
say that?
It's my understanding. Yeah, I don't have it right in front of me either.
Okay.
Yeah, and I sent the, what the original language.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have looked beforehand. Okay, and then what was the percentage again of the money that's going towards? You did, I think, say a number that was actually going to. Yeah.
Well, I think, I'd have to go back and look, because basically what's happened the last 3 years is there was a budget that was passed that had a bunch of different things. Several of those, like some of the community grants, didn't get out the door. So there was $2 million in the budget, but only a portion of it got spent. And so we've ended up with this big fund balance. And so that's why it's a little bit hard to answer the question, because if you just look at the budgets, not all of that is what actually happened in that year. And so a lot of the, like spending on shelter, for example, was basically unspent fund balance from prior years that got reappropriated. So, but I think that the other answer to your question is really on the website that has all that detail. And it does have kind of summary. I just don't know the actual percent. I just know, generally speaking, we've used a fair amount.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you ask the people on the survey, did you say, by the way, a fair amount of this is being spent? Yes, that's supposed to be child abuse and all that stuff.
I was not involved in making the survey, so I don't, but I think that, and I could get, I think in the plan that we'll talk about, the survey was part of that work as well. The survey.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. And then again, cheersanchorage.org is that website. So then the other piece about alcohol tax, like I said, is the strategic plan. So this work was done as part of that, but the outreach is really an ongoing project. This strategic plan was essentially something we funded to say, let's step back. This thing has been in use for a few years. We know there's some, there's kind of two big categories of questions. One is, what is the best use of the funding, right? Like, what is the most effective thing? How can we have the most impact? And that's really a budget and policy question. The other piece that we've discussed was really around kind of the hiccups and the challenges with implementation. So for example, it's one thing to say we want to get a bunch of community grants out. It's another thing when we have a health department who has only a few staff and is overburdened with a lot of different tasks, right? And so there was always these issues of actually getting the grant agreements out the door, getting the RFP so that people could apply for it, right? So there's all these kind of more implementation or administration issues that are identified in the plan, but are ones that need to be worked on kind of just to smooth out the process. So that's really the goal was to look ahead and look at our policy and kind of budget questions and making sure that we're achieving our goals like transparency, efficient use of the funds, but then also troubleshooting some of these other issues and putting those in the plan. So we worked with a steering committee of community members. And again, all the details about these are in the plans themselves. We worked with, we had some assembly folks. We had folks from different organizations representing youth, representing, education, representing behavioral health, like all these kind of different perspectives that are related to the uses of the funds. And then they also did community input. So there was the polling was around communications, but there was a survey that was put out. They were at various events, through the winter, you know, kind of gathering input on this plan. So really the plan is not just the city's plan, it has a lot of community input on what's in there. Oh yeah, this is the list of some of the outreach that was done. You know, also doing focus groups, talking with the alcohol industry, you know, what would your customers want to know about the tax they're paying, right? So a lot of different outreach there. And then basically where we are is we have a full strategic plan drafted, and the link is there. It's a big file, so I didn't attach it to the email. And then the short version that I think you guys have a copy of, or that we were gonna look at, was basically a 4-page plan. And it's basically just saying, what's the super short summary? So we have, here. We have our vision and our mission. So really, you know, and again, these are very broad statements. So it's not saying this $5 million or $15 million a year is going to by itself achieve these things, but it's really that bigger community vision and where this fits in. So safety and well-being, people have access to safe housing, meeting basic needs, feeling safe and connected. And then again, really drawing back to, these are the issues these are the problems we're trying to solve, or reduce, or have an impact on. We have our values, really, you know, we value connection, we value making government accessible, you know, kind of that broad language. And then we've got these goals. And I will say again, these are an active working draft. So the goals that you see up here are very specific. They say use alcohol tax funds for housing projects and programs serving low-income households, people experiencing homelessness. This is not, I'm not presenting this like this is the final what we've said. This is where we're trying to narrow down from that really huge picture to say, okay, we can't pay for all of it. What should we use this fund for? And so that's really what the plan is about. But again, you know, we worked on this through the spring and now into the summer. We need to sit down with the administration. The goal is to make this a full municipality plan. So what does that need to look like? And then again, a lot of the work is these immediate actions that are recommended are really a lot of that implementation stuff. Like who is the municipal person? Who is the point person for alcohol tax funding? We need better channels to get community input on where the funding should go year over year, right? Like not just this plan, but as we go through the budget process, how do people plug into that? Looking at other funding sources, how could we leverage other funding, right, to achieve our goals? And so there's a lot of kind of real specific things in there that we need to be. So with that, I'll stop talking and see if there's other questions about alcohol tax.
So Anna, I'm pretty sure I was on board with this whole alcohol tax. I do not recall the main goal, what you've got here, goal 1, which is housing. I really think that people wanted prevention and public safety was what we really pushed. And now suddenly those have been pushed down. And housing has been put first. Now, I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying that I think if you went out and did a survey now, I'm not sure if you would get this ranking. So
Yeah.
just hate to see all the money spent on goal 1 because the other goals are important.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that's really where, like I said, we went through this process. The plan that is drafted now reflects the community input. And there is a lot more nuance in it. So what we're trying to do is say, we heard what people want. We talked about things like safety, right? What does that mean? Or addressing homelessness. A lot of it does mean having a safe place to live, right? And so I'm not arguing that we should make it all housing, but just to say it's kind of how do you.
I'm thinking that you've got a whole population here in Anchorage.
Mm-hmm.
And it's being concentrated here when it should be concentrated across. And I once again don't disagree that safe housing doesn't benefit all of us, even for a smaller group of people. But I kind of just wish we would rise above and see how it would help all people first. Maybe, you know, just a little bit different ranking for me for the money. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And so I think, I'll just say too, I think, this graphic is really helpful. Because basically the downstream stuff, these are the problems that we're trying to solve, right? And so the theory is that we focus on these more positive, and again, I'm not just pointing at affordable housing, but education, right? All these other pieces. And I think the challenge that we have is how do we balance among those needs? And I think that's what this plan is trying to do. And so it's not, so the goals aren't necessarily in priority order, it's just the categories. But I think we're still working through that, right? It is what is the approach? Or do we say for the next year, we really go all in on something like safety, right? Or, you know, so maybe there's ways that we don't try to do it all at once. And anyway, so all that to say, there's an active conversation. And so these are very much draft.
Okay,
And so we'd love your input too.
thank you.
Where do these funds go? Does the municipality hand these out as grants?
So there's a lot of different things. Some of it goes to pay for, like, for example, it's paying for a domestic violence prosecutor, which is a muni position. So some of the money is paying for muni services. Some of it is community grants, although like I said, there's, you know, it's $2 million for grants, and then it hasn't really all gone out the door by the end of the fiscal year. And so some of that money just doesn't get used. Some of it is direct grants, like to Awake and STAR and some of the groups that work on sexual assault, domestic violence. They actually get line item grants in the budget right now. And that's another conversation, right? Is do we make everybody compete for the funding, or do we choose specific organizations, right? So all these kind of budgeting and policy questions are on the table.
I guess my question on the grants, you ever audit those?
That is a function of the health department. So I mean, the assembly, we
You're responsible. The Assembly's responsible.
right, and we have an audit department that basically, that's another issue, is there's a long list of audits that they have to do. And so I believe there is a grant auditing process, but
Maybe you could update it at the next meeting.
sure. And that would be a question maybe to also bring in the acting auditor, because I know another conversation separate from this is, as I said, they have a long list of audits. You know, we say you have to do these sunset audits, you have to do department audits. And what they've said is we need to prioritize because we don't have the capacity to do it.
Okay.
And so I think that's a bigger question maybe about auditing. Because I think, yeah, we definitely want to make sure that we're spending the money effectively, but the process to do that, there's some choke points right now.
And I think those questions kind of dial in on the recommended immediate actions, number 9 and 10. With number 9, it's like there's evaluation or procurement, contractor selection, contract recipient selection process or something. Number 9. And with regards to auditing, maybe that has to do with reporting, public publicization of reporting and metrics. A lot of times when you track grants, a lot of times it's just funds allocated versus funds spent. And so maybe
Right.
we're asking for a little bit more performance metric.
That's kind of where my question was going is does the strategic plan already include the metrics that are going to show that we're moving the needle in all these, in those, along those issues?
I think it's an attempt to start to do that. I think the question is then what do you build into like grant agreements, right? And if you're granting money to Awake and you're also granting money to an early literacy program, the metrics might need to be different.
Sure.
And so so I think that's something, basically, when this started, the alcohol tax started, it was in the middle of COVID and we had an understaffed municipality, right? And so a lot of these things that probably should have been done up front just weren't done. And so we're kind of going back a few years later so that, I think the plan doesn't say here are the metrics. It has some general ideas. But it does call for developing more of those things.
So that's right in your mission statement, right? It says we're going to do measurable impacts, right?
Yeah, and that's really the question. It's like, what are we measuring? And then how diverse are we measuring the different ways that we use it?
Yeah, and I guess that's at a strategic plan level, just say like, in grant agreements or in signed contracts, performance metrics will be defined and evaluated sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then one more question, we'll just move on. I guess generally it's more general, really. It's just if it's a targeted excise tax I think one of the things with regards to when it was implemented is that the excise tax would be targeted towards the kind of the negative impacts of alcohol. And that's one of the reasons like homelessness, child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, and public safety. We're seeing, at least when it was marketed as an initial ballot initiative, as those sorts of things. And when you poll, people tend to say, we want it to be everything. So just I think a general thought is that it's hard to poll on one specific thing and keep it aligned with the initial pitch to the voters. I think that might be just me changing the words of what Carla's saying, but I don't know. That's more just a thought than a question. Everybody okay with moving on?
Okay, yeah, and I'll just mention, like I said, these are actively drafts. Timeline, I don't exactly know. I just put your next steps, because we presented these to the assembly. Right now, there's not full alignment on the assembly. Like, we haven't come to agreement really, or we haven't gotten to the point that we're saying these are the goals. So that's why I said they're very much draft. But would love your guys' feedback. And then, of course, working with the admin folks, kind of how we deal with that. So I don't have a timeline on that one. The next one does have a specific timeline, so I can give some updates. And again, there's, this is one where, I guess I'll say, so we, I think it must have been a voter approved thing. We have marijuana tax. I think it was back in 2016, 2017. So it's been around for a while. Up to last year, it was, or actually, so up to this year, all of that money was just going in the general fund and it just offset property taxes. So it was like our motor vehicle fuel tax, where it's just, it goes in the mix, right? It wasn't dedicated. And unlike the alcohol tax, of course, this already exists. So the thing that changed last year was voters approved Proposition 14, which dedicates the money we're already collecting, that 5% tax, and moves it into that dedicated fund so it can only be used for certain purposes. So it's similar to alcohol tax, but it's got a distinct set of uses that we'll get into. So first, to start with, we're talking about early education and childcare. A lot of times people conflate those terms, but just to be super clear, early education is basically pre-kindergarten, but it could also be home visiting, literacy programs, really with an educational component. That can overlap with childcare, but childcare can be up to age 12. It is a formal program for supervising kids. It's not just dropping off at grandma's house, although that is a form of childcare. And it can also be with kids that would overlap with that pre-K population, but it is, as I said, up to age 12, and it's really out of school care also. So that's the universe of kind of what we're talking about. And it's narrower than the alcohol tax. So before I get into Prop 14 and what we're doing, just to give some info on the need, basically what we've done is also a planning process where working with a group and implementation team, we've done some research. We've leveraged a lot of the work that the governor's child care task force has done, and others looked at what happens in other states, really just understanding what are the problems, because we know child care is an issue. We know, people's ability to access pre-K is an issue. So what does that look like? We've had a declining number of child care programs. It's really hard to get a spot. There's been plenty of news articles about this. It's really expensive. It stops people from being in the labor force, so that is an issue, right? If it costs more to have someone watch your kid during the day than you will get paid, then why would you go get a job, right? So this issue of people staying out of the workforce because of this. The average childcare cost per month was $982, and that's kind of a minimum, right? So the problem is it's really expensive to pay for. And so that is a huge barrier, right? And then of course, if you have a single earner household, it's even more. And so it's limited. So there's the access issues, there's, cost issues. We know that it has huge long-term benefits. Like I said, if you invest in the first years of life, people are more likely to graduate from high school. They're more prepared for school. They earn more money over time, right? So there's an economic benefit to this for everybody who goes through a child care program or education program. The slide that I forgot to include though is, so it's really expensive and we're paying our providers, our workers in that workforce, very little money. So it's this huge disconnect. It's super expensive for people to use, and we can't pay people enough. And if we tried to pay people more in the current system, it just costs more, right? So there's this huge problem that we have to wrestle with. And it's not something the city can just solve, but that's what we're trying to do is how do we keep people in the workforce? How do we keep, those programs staffed up so they can accept kids? Because there's a lot of rules around what you can do. And then therefore, how do we then help people access this more? So there's a lot of kind of issues within this field or in this industry that we have to deal with. So then comes in Proposition 14. This is, again, I provided the language, but essentially it dedicates the marijuana tax to this purpose. It establishes an accountability board, so an advisory board at the city to make recommendations about where this funding should go. And then as of January 1st of this year, all of that tax money is being put in a dedicated fund. So it's not been spent yet, but it's sitting there. It's waiting for the decision of where it should go. And we get about $5 million annually of marijuana tax. So it's smaller than alcohol tax.
So
It's between 5 and 6. It kind of spiked during COVID. It's gone down a little bit.
that's gross.
Yeah, and so basically everything except the cost to collect the tax is what goes into this dedicated. And that's like alcohol tax. So allowed uses of the funds, this is specific language from the charter. Again, it just spells out in more detail what's allowed. And then I'll also note, it says prioritize utilization of existing school facilities for childcare and early ed programs. So that also intersects with ASD or other school buildings. Like, could you put, pre-K programs in there or childcare? Okay, sorry, I think my slides got out of order, but this is essentially what I was saying. And that's the problem. High cost to parents, low pay for providers. So again, this $5 million is not going to fully solve that, but how do we insert that bit of money to start to solve the structural issue? Here we go. Sorry, I think I put these in the wrong order. So you can see providers make very little money. There's a high degree of satisfaction working in this field. But when you can't pay the bills, then you may not stay in the job, right? So that's the issue. So Proposition 14 happened, and the question is, where do we put this money? So since last summer, we started this project with an implementation team. You can see it's got assembly members, school board, Head Start, Thread, health department, and we actually made a really intentional effort to recruit parents and providers to be part of that discussion. And so their job is really to collect this information, make recommendations. We were working closely with the Alaska Children's Trust, who it's basically they put up part of the funding, and then we put up part of the funding for this project to do the consulting work that needed to be done. And again, working with not just starting from scratch, but looking at all the work that's already been done, looking at what's happening at the state level and federal level, and making sure that we're looking at where we can have the most impact. So there was, again, a public engagement process parallel to the alcohol tax one, different project, presentations, outreach. There was a few meetings. There was an online survey, and also intentional outreach to providers themselves to understand, like what would help you expand your slots, what would help you keep your staff, right? Kind of those more targeted questions. So we looked at what's most difficult, what are the barriers for parents? And again, we kind of covered a lot of these, but it shows up in our survey. This is all local data. The interesting thing from the survey results is they asked, what is the best use of the fund? And you'll see pay child care providers more and providing benefits. That was an answer not just from providers or employees, but also from parents. There's a really broad, very broad understanding, including people who use childcare and pre-K, that is a barrier. Like, keeping people in those jobs is the barrier, and making them competitive with other wages. So you can see there's a lot of other ideas there. But just to say, a lot of what the implementation group has been focused on is solving that issue of the workforce, whatever that looks like. So the next steps on that one, again, there's a lot of materials. I provided some information. There's two pieces that we're working on. One, I think I mentioned this last month. One is an ordinance creating that accountability board that is required in charter. So there's an ordinance on our agenda for Tuesday. And again, that just creates the board. It doesn't make funding decisions. But that one, the goal is to have a broad mix of people on the board who are going to give these recommendations. And then going forward per charter, one of their jobs every year is to make recommendations to the mayor and the assembly how that money should be spent. So even though they're not constituted this year, going forward in future years, that will be their job. And there's, other things they can do as well, as far as recommendations and best practices. So that's one piece. Once the board is created, the mayor will start putting people forward, people apply, and then it'll become a new board like you guys are. Mission. The other one is that the implementation team, the IT, that we were using that acronym, basically put together some broad recommendations for how to spend the funding. And so they're working on finalizing that. And again, that's coming from the community and will go to the mayor and the assembly. It'll go to the board. And basically is saying, you know, we know we have limited funds, but here's recommendations of how to be strategic about that. So again, I don't have what that budget recommendation is yet, but that it's active with this process. And then especially once the board is created, then we can start putting the structure in place for that to move forward. I think that was my last slide. Yeah. So.
Questions? With regards to the AO that's in front of the assembly, it's moving the accountability board from it's creating the accountability board and moving the decision-making for grant-making authority to kind of recommendation strategy. Is that true?
That was, yeah, and that was a big point of discussion. So, in the charter language, and again, it was passed before I was on the assembly, so I might have raised some questions about this, but in the charter language, it says that the board can have the ability to issue grants. And so, so in an earlier version of the ordinance, we put that in there. In the substitute version, we pulled some of that language out thinking, okay, realistically, that's not what's going to happen year one. But this board, in theory, does have a pretty broad set of powers that it could exercise. But I think that's going to be kind of an ongoing question of what this board should do and what it has capacity to do, because it will need staff support as well. So in the ordinance also, and in the charter language, it allows creation of basically an executive director position that would be paid for out of these funds. And it would operate not the same as, but kind of like the Anchorage Equal Rights Commission, which is also in the charter, also has its own executive director, is not completely independent, but has a little bit more independence versus a department, if that makes sense. So some of those things are kind of actively under discussion. This is just to put the structure in place.
And then another question is, I guess, collaboration or possible funding for, I know there was a funds in the state budget that ended up not in this final state budget that for early reading intervention to help support the Alaska Reads Act, something like that. It's maybe not early enough, but just as an example, you know, maybe something earlier. Was that, you know, partnerships with ASD, is that possible for the funds with the language and structure that's in the language?
I think, well, I'll defer about Reads Act stuff to Katie, but I think in general, we did have member Carl Jacobs participate as board member on this. So kind of making sure that we had that connection. And I think a lot of those specifics have not been worked out, but generally speaking, we have kept close eye on, you know, the state childcare subsidies that are, you know, in all those pieces, and to say, we don't want to duplicate what's happening. How could we use our funds effectively? So yeah, I think there's totally, that hasn't been figured out, but that's the kind of thing we need to talk about and the kind of thing the board can work on.
And the implementation team is just gonna, it'll basically be disbanded as soon as the accountability board is.
Yeah. In fact, our last meeting was yesterday. The consultant who's working with Children's Trust is going to put together that package, and then probably August is when it'll come out. But yeah, their job is done at this point. Basically.
All right, sorry, one last thing. It's more so just appreciating when my experience at kind of the state level, we see sometimes proposals we put out there with regards to childcare. You see some that don't really balance like the supply and demand equation. Childcare tax credits, like we supported those, but you know, they kind of lean more heavily on increasing demand on existing childcare providers and services. And so just, it's kind of tough, but a board might be a little bit better sometimes than a legislative body at balancing the supply and demand equation of, you know, if you offer credits or vouchers or credits to employers for offering more accessible childcare, but there's not more services available. And it's more so just a thought to keep in mind as the process moves forward, is just balancing the equation is important. Otherwise you hit choke points, which you know well. Any other questions? I appreciate you coming.
Yeah.
There's kind of short notice and
Yeah.
a request by myself that, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, and it was actually good timing because like I said, these are both actively in process. And yeah, I think I will bring back to our groups too, that I think it would be great to do when they have those recommendations, to bring them to you guys too and have that presentation.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, and if anybody has any questions or anything else, just feel free to reach out. So.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right. moving up to I appreciate it, Katie, for waiting. Thanks for hanging out and thanks for coming back. I know I'd said summer off, but
No problem.
yeah, I appreciate you coming back. We'll move on to the ASD report. Here.
All right, no problem. It's summer, but there's still a lot going on, maybe not school. But a lot of the capital projects take place during the summer. So our teams in capital planning and maintenance and working with our contractors are very busy this time of year. The other thing that took place was that the operating budget and the supplemental was signed by the governor with a few vetoes, but we were very happy to see that the one-time appropriation for K-12 was preserved, as well as one-time funding for pupil transportation, which I think is particularly relevant to the recent request in our budget of a substantial increase for transportation support from the MUNI. So in total, there was approximately 175 million that was provided to the foundation program, which is our primary state entitlement money for education, and then a little more than 7 million for pupil transportation. So let me get my cheat sheet. So for ASD, the one-time funds equates to approximately 49 million. So that's a very welcome relief to our budget this year, as well as approximately 2 million in supplemental pupil transportation funding. And so I think that we talked about this in previous meetings, but just to reiterate, I don't think there's been an adjustment to the rates for pupil transportation since 2015 or so. And then, so that is definitely sorely needed. There's also some talk, I don't know that it's getting much traction. Previously, pupil transportation was funded through a reimbursement method, essentially, so that the state would recoup the cost of the transportation, and then it went to a per pupil formula in or around, I think, I'm going to get that wrong. I'm not going to pull from my memory on that one. But so for many years, it's been in the status of being that flat per pupil dollar amount, which has, as transportation costs have significantly increased, I think the CPI or inflationary metric on transportation was like 30% or something the last time that I looked at it across that same period, while that has remained flat. So we're very excited about that. Pupil transportation money to be able to continue kind of, maintaining the level of service, because as some of you know, with pupil transportation, just because, we lose, let's just say that along a route, we lose 10 students, but there's still 15 or I'm making numbers up, so don't hold me to these, like 15 or 20 students on a route, you don't want to eliminate that route. But what that means is when it's a flat per pupil funding metric is that there is reduced funding for maintaining the same level of service to our neighborhoods. So that's one of those things that we'll be keeping an eye on and making sure that we're kind of being really mindful about what's happening with pupil transportation funding in the future. So the funds that were vetoed were the maintenance of effort funds, and I spoke about this previously. Essentially, it's that disagreement with the U.S. Department of Education around the provision for providing the ESSER funds, which was the COVID relief funds, to education. There was in order to receive those funds by the state had to essentially, verify that there was going to be kind of the same level of state funding was going to be provided, so that, and it's all about equity and making sure that low-income students or communities or low-income districts weren't impacted by this influx of federal money, so that the state withheld funds essentially. But what ended up happening was, because at the same time there were all of these changes in enrollment and things happening, it looks like some districts did receive a reduction in funding when the hold harmless provision from the state dropped off in FY22 and FY23. And I'm sorry, this is all very technical, so I apologize if I'm not articulating it well enough, but I think we spoke about this in a previous meeting. So essentially what the feds are saying is you owe districts money. You're out of compliance with what you said you would do, the requirements of receiving the COVID relief funds. And so you need to make this right in order to be in good standing with the federal government. So because we didn't make that appropriation, well, I guess it was included as an appropriation that was forwarded to the governor, but there is a difference of opinion between the administration and the feds with whether or not those funds are truly, whether it really truly is out of compliance and a disparity. So those were vetoed. I think the amount that was set aside for ASD in the last formula was about 6.6 million. So that would be a reduction of about 6.6. And then there was also the additional supplemental funding for K through 3 students and K through 3 students in title schools was vetoed for about 5.2 million, which would have been about another 2.5 for ASD. But overall, we're very pleased to have a little bit of relief in our budget. Right now, one of the things that we're working toward is coming up with that list. So as you know, in our last approved budget, there were many items that got trimmed out to achieve a balanced budget. And so the administration is going to be doing that list and also taking a look at anything that may have come up since that time to consider adding back into the budget. However, it's probably what some of the recommendation is going to be is that we really use that to lever down our risk in our budget. So one of the things that we did do, and this was discussed in joint session, and also I think we talked about it here, is that the approved budget factors in an attrition amount at our current rate of vacancies. Now, ideally, we wouldn't want our current vacancies to be sustained because that impacts the ability of the schools to perform certain levels of service. We don't want that to continue. That wouldn't be a preference to see that continue, but to build back up that capacity to provide for programming that we're used to seeing. So what we'll likely do is lever down the risk that's built into this budget, and then do some of the things that we really, really need to do based on what we're seeing for enrollment. So for example, one of the things that we talked about is that the school board actually restored in this approved budget was the holdback positions. Those are kind of that pool of positions that we set aside in the budget, not knowing exactly where we're going to, where those positions are going to be assigned or go, but knowing that there are bubbles of classroom sizes and needs at different schools that we really need to deploy additional personnel to be able to handle those. Some of those holdback positions have been kind of slotted for things that we really, really need to do, but that are maybe a different kind of position. So what we're trying to do is kind of do a reset and make sure that schools have what they need in this current budget plan. So that will be the focus. We have a plan of submitting a proposal to the school board for the first meeting in August. So I'll see if I can pull that off. I'm looking at the calendar. It might be a pretty quick turnaround time, but that's our goal. So I'll have more information for the meeting in August. And I think that is it for us right now. It's really just summertime, getting schools ready, doing all of those projects that we're waiting for kids not to be in the building, and then taking a look at what's happening with our funding. So.
Any questions?
I have hopefully quick question. Preventative maintenance things. Do you have a decent budget for that, or are you more reaction, like something busts, you fix it, or is there a lot of preventative? For preventative maintenance.
I'm not the expert for our capital planning and projects and major maintenance, but related to the budget, we do preserve a pretty, the department does a really good job of keeping those lists up to date and accurate. I actually have a capital planning meeting this afternoon. We meet regularly to go over that list and to identify if there's any needs that have come up that we need to take a look at and reprioritize or fund or, take off. Sometimes what'll happen is a project will be finished and there's additional funds and then those can be reprogrammed, right, to something else. So I feel like the district does a really good job of keeping its thumb on the priorities and the needs. However, as exists, I think, across the state, there's a pretty tremendous list, with limited resources. So when something comes up, let's just say, so they have their list of all of the short-term fixes that kind of need to happen, like maybe patching a roof or something, and then roof replacement, right? So they have the major list and then they have kind of the tick list of things that need to be done as part of that preventative maintenance. When something comes up, we just retool. So if, let's say a roof springs a leak and we realize, oh, this was actually worse than we thought it was going to be, that just gets reprioritized. And so there might be other projects that were previously funded that maybe are just paused for the time being, or taking a look at where those projects may have come in under budget and we can kind of retool the existing funds that we have available to meet those needs. And we do that pretty quickly. I'm pretty impressed for the size of the district and the amount of facilities and kind of how that all works, how quickly we can get that done. It feels like that is an area of strength for the district, but I think with the challenge of limited resources that we all kind of have to exist in, I guess, is how I would describe it.
And the reason for my question is because we had heard years ago from planning, community planning.
Yeah.
They were like, if we could just have a budget for maintenance as opposed to a budget for fixing it afterwards.
Yeah.
It would be so far ahead.
Yeah.
But they couldn't get it pushed over. So with the aging, we obviously have a lot of aging infrastructure.
We do. And I think because of that, they've done it feels like because of that, there's been a real focus on that in the last few years, especially because taking a look at the district's overall footprint and how we might need to reconfigure or strategize or combine schools or close schools or kind of do that full assessment of the right sizing of the district. I think that is kind of at the top of the list for looking at that. What facilities are actually going to be effective at handling those changes, but also long-term probably saving money, because you probably wouldn't want to combine two schools into a school that's going to need to be replaced in the next 5 years.
Yeah. You combine two schools and you can turn the empty school into daycare.
Yes.
And a number of projects got funded in the school major maintenance fund this year, right? I'm not sure if ASC had any of those.
We did. Yeah, I think we did. I probably need to look at that again because I don't think that I've looked at it in a while. But I can bring that back to the next meeting.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Maybe that. And then we got presented a few different options of what a pupil-teacher ratio might look like.
Okay.
Just with the one-time increase and what the plan for next year is, what the actual PTR ended up.
So the PTR will remain the same. So one of the things that the school board did reinstate through the budget process was maintaining the PTR. So that will stay the same. But it might be some of those like targeted positions that we recognize that, based on what we know now about how things are shaping up with our enrollment or with what, the different schools' needs are proving to be, it would probably be some of those like targeted positions that would get added back in, if any.
Any other questions? Just time brief, the OMB report.
Ready?
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to step away. I'm sorry.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Like to one, so sorry about that, but we'll see you next month.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm Marilyn Bonzoff. I am the acting director at this time for the Office of Management and Budget. My day job is Deputy Director of Office of Management and Budget. Right now, we are just starting to get started on our budget process for the 2025 fiscal year. We'll work with the administration on priorities. We'll send to the department those priorities. Departments send, we'll most likely work with the mayor on working on a proposed budget that we have to submit to the Assembly in Public October 2nd, 90 days before the fiscal year end. Actually, let me back up. 120 days before the fiscal year end, we'll also present to the Assembly in the Public preliminary, what is called the 120-day memo, and it's preliminary revenue estimates for next year, preliminary capital models for next year that will then be further integrated into the budget, the mayor's budget that's proposed on later. That's what we're working on. We should be, we have a draft calendar, but that has to go through the mayor to make sure that's what she wants to go out. And once that's solidified, it'll be posted on our OMB website. What goes into that budget that is presented on October 2nd is the operating budget for the general government, the municipal general government, capital budget for general government, and then also what we call the acronym CIB, capital improvement budget. And that's for the 2025 year. And that's a plan for hopeful projects that aren't necessary, that we will then go and seek funding for once that capital improvement budget is approved. Additionally, with that capital budget document is what's called the capital improvement program, which then puts out the ask for capital items for the next 6 years, the budget year 25, and then 5 years past that. Additionally, so that's all general government. Additionally, all of the enterprise and utilities will also have submitted budgets on October 2nd, which will be AWU, solid waste, port, Merrill Field, and also we include ACDA.
What's the status of the ACFR, the annual comprehensive?
That was what Alden Thurn, our CFO, was here to discuss. If you want a detailed, do you want us to grab him for a discussion, or?
I think it's okay. It's just, it was just, roughly, do we know that, like a rough timeline? I know last time it was like maybe in the next month or two was kind of what we had heard, I thought.
I think it's down 2 days.
Okay.
It's out within days.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you for the report. Next is BAC member discussion. Really, it's just, I think we have like 4 possible future meeting topics: sales tax proposal, property tax changes and assessment methods, especially there's state legislation passed related to that. Active audits is one that got brought up today, and maybe planning and zoning and tax implications of that. Yeah, open to discussion.
I think we need to control our meeting as far as time. The assembly, she takes an hour. So we don't really have enough time at the end, at 5 or 10 minutes. And so I would like to put a time limit on the assembly presentation.
Okay, and I'll say today too. I mean, I asked her to kind of be the meat and potatoes of the meeting for today. If we're looking at today as an example. So
They don't, through the chair, they don't normally present.
yeah, I had asked her to kind of be the meat and potatoes presentation today.
And I thought that was a worthy presentation.
Well, it was, but there's a lot of areas that could have been shortened. I mean, we spend an hour there and we got to press for time.
Well, in her defense, we also asked policy questions not necessarily relevant to budget.
They weren't.
No, but
I mean, I'm
they
open to,
contribute.
definitely open to input. I think, you know, maybe as a baseline, we'll use another meeting that doesn't have the assembly kind of carrying through to presenting for a main topic that we have, you know. I can throw time blocks on our agenda to working with Aaron.
I
for the
would
next
put a
meeting.
limit on the Assembly General presentation for about 20 minutes.
I definitely won't figure out though, and if we do time blocks, we'll do it on the whole agenda. But so that kind of leads, if we want to do time blocks, how much do we want to leave for BAC member, BAC open discussion?
Well, it depends on our workload too. You know, I think we need to spend more time talking amongst ourselves about things. You know, I think that's, you know, be helpful. Because we're here for an hour and I mean, it's okay, but time is of the essence for a lot of these things.
That's one of the reasons I asked her to come today is because I think at the next meeting is when they're discussing some of these things. So maybe, you know, since it's open discussion across the commission
Just
right
put it
now,
on the agenda, 20 minutes.
since it's open discussion across BAC right now, is alcohol and marijuana tax something we want to discuss a resolution on or some
Mhm.
kind of recommendations? I know we had
Right,
talked about some of
exactly.
this.
See, we don't have enough time to talk about those.
But is that something that we do want to talk about is the
Yeah,
question?
there's a lot of things that we need to talk about that are relevant besides what's going on with the assembly. And I think that, I talked to the girl the other day when I got lost in the hallway. And I gave her my booklet that's got what our responsibilities are under the ordinance and all of those things. And they're going to be making us copies for all of the board members. And that way we can see what our responsibilities are, what our authorities are and all of those items. And we can spend 10 or 15 minutes going through that at the next meeting or so. So we all know what we can do and what we can't do.
It's a topic that we can add. Marilyn?
Excuse me, and if I may, part of the budget process is typically the Budget Advisory Commission does submit a resolution on how they feel about the proposed budget. So that is
Yeah, we should be doing a lot of that.
And we did do that last year. That's something we
Yeah,
had a
we
work
used to do
session.
that all the time.
Well, through the chair, also, I would agree with you. We have become a committee of presentations, which we didn't used to do
Exactly.
quite as many. I think what the assembly has going on directly affects how we consider how the budget is spent. So I do think the assembly is important, but we have become like this committee of somebody come give us a presentation for 45 minutes. Some of it's important, some of it's fluff, but I agree. We used to have a lot more discussion, a lot more input than we are now. So, but the presentations sometimes are very informative. So, I don't know, maybe we cut
Well,
down.
you know, when you go to the assembly, they limit you to 3 minutes.
That's a good idea. We'll be out of here in 9 minutes.
So I appreciate that perspective because I've not been here for very long and it seemed, I've been questioning what we do here because it has seemed to
That
be
book would
just
be helpful.
presentations and not as much discussion and input. So
And then that way we'll all know as board members what we're doing, how we're doing it, what our authorities are. And I think we need to take a more positive approach on the board to say, we don't think this is a very good idea. We think it could be changed to this or that and make recommendations.
That's one of the things that's tough too, which definitely open to input is like, if we want to do a resolution on alcohol and marijuana tax, you know, we need the time to work a resolution and also get the backup information so that we have, you know, the knowledge to work the resolution. So I don't know if I'm open to doing an alcohol and marijuana tax resolution. I'm just,
Mr. Chair, I would move that we adjust the agenda to allow the school district 20 minutes presentation.
You can't make a motion.
so I guess what I'll put out for discussion is how it's how we want to approach a resolution for alcohol and marijuana tax. And, you know, I'll take this into account for the next meetings you know, I agree. I think we need more time in order to work things. It's just balancing, having,
Yeah.
you know,
Great.
a little knowledge, you know, a little time on background information and working. So we want to work that alcohol and marijuana tax resolution, like, we could do it at the next meeting, as a main agenda item where we can have a working meeting. Any thoughts?
Through the chair, here's the next problem. What do you need from us budget wise? Or what's going on with the budget? Like next meeting, how close are we gonna be to needing to look and review?
So by the next meeting, there would probably, sorry, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the next meeting would be what, mid-August, and by then there would not be, the mayor's proposed budget goes out October 2nd. And so between now and then, there won't be, or I guess, so September, the end of September is when the first publication goes out for the 25 budget. So that's a 120-day memo.
Yeah, and last year we had a presentation from OMB in, I believe, October or September on the proposed budget, and then we did our resolution in November.
So we do have time next
We did,
meeting
I think we definitely have time.
to look at marijuana and alcohol.
It's, if we want to do that or any of these other ones, I think it's a good idea to close the loop on that or have a working meeting, you know, a working session. I think it'd be hard to get quorum for a working session and,
Yeah.
but we could work resolution and then circulate it by email too.
Yeah.
But
I think I would like to discuss it and do a resolution, especially alcohol. Marijuana looks pretty cut and dry.
I agree.
Yeah.
But, and Mr. Chair, if you don't mind me saying, maybe what we do on these presentations, I know we ask people to come in and do them, and so it's hard to put stipulations on it, but maybe they come in with the presentation idea of how does this affect taxes, muni budget, you know, hey, we passed this, you know, AO, whatever, or we passed this and this is how it's going to affect the budget.
Mhm.
Just like when I asked her if there's no extension of the house, how are you going to get more taxes out of that?
Mhm.
So,
yeah, I think it'd be good if we settle on what we're doing next meeting early and then circulate around questions to send to the presenter too. And we can give them that general direction every time. And then we can circulate kind of pre-questions, address some of the things that people want early. And so for the next meeting, from here, we don't want anything on sales tax, property tax, active audits. What we want more so is to spend it on a working session on alcohol tax resolution. So
I think also, you know, that there's some other things that we could, you know, propose. You know, we all admit, and I talked to a couple assembly people, and they agree, our streets are in terrible shape. Terrible. Because when we passed the gasoline assessment, there's about 14 to 15 million dollars there that we wanted to use and directed them to set that up in a separate account. Could only be used for street maintenance, not construction, repair and maintenance. And it's going in and acted as, you know, the general fund. So I think that we should work in the future to have that go into a separate trust account with restrictions on it. Use asphalt, repaving streets, not rebuilding, not building, just maintenance.
well, so is this something we want to address at the next meeting, or do we want to do sales tax, property tax, or
Let's
spend
go
it
ahead
on
and do the sales tax and property tax.
or we can spend it on working on a resolution? Is the other thing.
me, I guess it's what the assembly has on their agenda and what we need to get, because we have always been, I feel like, or lately we've been reactionary rather than precautionary.
Right, yep.
On the stuff that the assembly takes up. So, do you know are they addressing this anytime?
I'd say alcohol tax is the most pressing. That's one of the reasons we had had her here today. Sales tax is probably gonna be in the next, I'd say 2 months. So,
We can fit it.
I think I'd lean towards, alcohol, marijuana, or alcohol tax resolution first. It'd be nice to have a working meeting and circulate it by email. And I mean, I can work up a draft based on the comments that we've had today. And then do the sales tax proposal at the next meeting. But again, that would be a presentation, from Project Anchorage, because we don't know what the sales tax proposal really details are right now. So that's kind of the question is, do we do it that way? Or do we work the resolution for alcohol tax at the next meeting and do a presentation later on sales tax?
Do both if we,
Well, I think the liquor tax and the marijuana tax could be pretty straight. Just, there's no cost benefit analysis being done. Why not? You got 500 kids, how much did you spend on those people? Okay, that way you get some nuts and bolts of things. How many homeless people do we have? Anybody know?
at my house. Just kidding. Just a 91-year-old mother.
Yeah, and that is easier. Alcohol tax is meant to supplant things. It's not
You know,
funding whole programs.
I
which
would
makes
like to
metrics
see
harder.
more numbers, I guess, at least I would. So I can see how effective things are.
That's one of the issues. Numbers take time.
Well, it depends. These departments should know. They can just give the assembly folks a report, or we can bring them in.
So we gotta move on real quick. I see Matthew Farina's on. I just want to make sure that that's not for public input. Or maybe if it is, to give you a real brief, since you've been on, a chance for public input.
Matthew works with the assembly, so I think he may.
Perfect. So then really, I guess, to close it out is just what do people want to do at next meeting?
Mr. Chair, if you eliminate, since it's summer, if you eliminate ASD for next meeting, if Marilyn is as brief as she was today, right, then I think we can fit in both, even if it's just a working of something passed for the taxes, the marijuana, alcohol, and then only print the presentation, and then we take up a discussion of the presentation at the next meeting. If it can happen,
We
I
got
think you
time.
can fit it in. You might also warn BAC members, and we've done this before, that there's a lot on the agenda. Can you please allot another 30 minutes for discussion?
It'll be tough to excuse ASD next time because it's right after they're coming back from summer break, school board meeting, in which they'll discuss right sizing
Okay.
and the budget for next year. Yeah, we can throw them both on the agenda. We can pre-work some alcohol tax resolution. We can probably add time boxes on the agenda for various things. And when people see the agenda, send questions for any hard numbers you want to see, because it's hard for them to bring them up on the spot. Speaking
Right.
from experience as somebody who's done presentations, it's tough to say the numbers without getting prepped on them. So send questions as soon as you see the agenda
Okay,
or anything like that, and it'll make it go faster too. And it'll provide more time. But I agree. I think it's good input. I think we do need to be a little more proactive and positive on actions that we take.
And by next meeting, you should have 5 members left.
Ideally,
4
yeah.
members.
It was streamlined.
well, we might, you might check and see what the staff is doing to, mayor's office.
It's my
What
understanding they're
doing
gonna
to
send a
get,
few to the
get more
assembly.
people on.
Yeah. It was just with the timing and the cadence of
Yeah.
meetings, it was tough. But is any more discussion?
Thank you for bringing it up. Thank you for addressing it. I think it's important.
I agree. Yeah. With that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Actually, I don't think we need to because we don't have quorum.
We don't have quorum, so.
I think we're good.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the input you guys And
Say
thanks
for
coming out.
executive decision, we're adjourning the meeting.
Yep.
See?
No, I agree. Today, though, I will give the assembly